introduce yourself. Basically, why don't we just kick it off with Tom. Let me just, before Tom's about to give the first presentation for the first panel, as you know, part of the reason we're here is because we've been doing, the NEA has been doing research on artists in the workforce for about 3 decades. And we have, you know, it's probably time for a fresh perspective and to get some points of view. There have been fresh perspectives injected throughout this process, but I think we've reached a point where we ask ourselves, are we continuing to study the right information, use the right data? Do we want to pursue new approaches, ask new research questions, and what better way than, I think, to have Tom kick it off?
Thank you, Sunil, and thank all of you for joining us here. And
Tom, could you come to the speaker's chair? Sorry.
Oh, sure.
I should have said that at the outset, sorry.
Again, thank you for joining us. I hope to give you some historical perspective on the nature of the studies that the Research Office has conducted on artists. Our studies fall into 3 categories, 3 types of artist data that we've analyzed. First, primary data collected from specific artist groups. In those cases, we've studied choreographers, visual artists, and jazz artists, and we have Joan Jeffri here who conducted a jazz artist study on our behalf. Second, we've done secondary data collection through membership surveys of artist organizations such as unions or service organizations, and those examples are studies of actors and musicians. And finally, secondary data collected by statistical agencies such as the statistical agencies of the federal government, such as the U.S. Census Bureau and the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Our latest report, Artists in the Workforce, falls into this last or third category. The 2 data sources it uses are from the decennial censuses from 1990 and 2000, and from the American Community Surveys data from 2003 to 2005. These are the artist occupations that are covered. The U.S. Census determines the respondent's occupation through a series of questions such as, who do you work for? What industry do you work in? What are your principal activities and duties at work? And based on the information provided, people are assigned job titles, which are then grouped into categories or occupations. And I'll describe a few of the ones that are a little bit less obvious, such as art directors, fine artists, and animators. Those include a broad group, crafts artists, painters, sculptors, illustrators, as well as media artists. Designers, a very large and diverse group, includes commercial, industrial designers, fashion designers, graphic designers, interior designers, as well as set and exhibit designers. Entertainers and performers include anything from comedians and puppeteers to ventriloquists and jugglers. Nearly 2 million Americans are artists as determined by the Census Bureau, and you can see their proportions in the various particular occupations that I mentioned. I should note that people who have more than one job are counted in the job in which they work the most number of hours in the survey week. Therefore, not surprisingly, there are a large number of artists who are working in the arts as a second job because they may be working in another job to help support their arts activity. Based on BLS estimates, an additional 300,000 people hold second jobs in these artist occupations. The number of artists has kept pace with the growth in the overall labor force. In 1970, there were approximately 730,000 artists. This grew to 1.7 million from 1970 to 1990. A much larger proportional gain than for the labor force as a whole, and of course this is reflected in the steeper line for artists during that time period. Between 1990 and 2005, the number of artists and the total labor force tracked much more closely, This may indicate over this period the arts have established a firm position in the workforce. Artists are highly concentrated in urban areas. Opportunities for artistic employment are greater in metropolitan areas. The 10 metropolitan areas with the most artists are listed on this slide. As you can see, more than 1/5 of the artists are located in Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, Washington, and Boston. And finally, nearly half of all artists reside in 30 metropolitan areas, in contrast to only 37% of the total labor force residing in those metropolitan areas. The West and South have been seen to show the greatest growth. In Nevada, Utah, Oregon, and Arizona, the artist population grew from 2.5 to 5 times the rate of that of the U.S. labor force. Florida and Georgia led the South with 23% growth, double the national average. 29% of all artists now live in the West, and another 29% in the South. Some key trends we looked at were education, employment, income, and diversity. Artists are generally more educated than the workforce as a whole. Artists have college degrees at approximately double the rate of the total labor force. Furthermore, the proportion of artists with degrees has been rising. Artists generally earn less than workers with similar levels of education. The median income for artists working full-time was $35,000 in 2005, compared with $43,000 for all professional workers. When artist income is adjusted for inflation, there was no increase between 2000 and 2005. For the 45% of artists who did not work full-time all year, however, the median income was only $20,000. Reflecting their entrepreneurial tendencies, artists are much more likely to be self-employed than the American labor force as a whole. Artists are 3.5 times more likely than other workers, to be more precise. Not surprisingly, artists are less likely to have full-time, full-year jobs. Instead, artists are more likely to work part-time. They work, in general, fewer hours and fewer hours per week. Women remain underrepresented in several artist occupations. Visual artists are an exception. At a greater percentage of women than men work part-time only. As you can see from this slide, the highest proportion of women are found in design and fine arts occupations, and the lowest among architects. And in conclusion, trends from 1990 to 2005 are similar to the overall labor force as they are for artists in terms of steady growth in the percentage and greater diversity. Regional growth concentrated in the South and the West. Important differences for artists: higher levels of education, more likely to be self-employed, and low earnings relative to education. And finally, I want to give you a few highlights from our latest research note. Compares unemployment rates and trends between the fourth quarter of 2007 and fourth quarter of 2008 for artists and professional workers. Artists had twice the unemployment rate of professional workers. Unemployment rates rose faster than for the total workforce. Performing artists, fine artists, and writers have the highest unemployment rates. 74,000 artists left the workforce, although the total workforce gained 800,000 during this time period. I would encourage you to pick up a copy of that note, which is in the back. And for those of you that are not here, I would suggest going to our NEA.arts.gov and see on our website our publications, including the note. Or if you have interest in our research, email us at research@arts.gov. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom, for the plug. Very good. We're going to have another presenter, and then we will take some questions. Greg Wassall, who's here to help extend this analysis further back in time, actually the 1940s, if I'm not mistaken, also using government data sources. Should have an artist here to fill the spare time with maybe a violin music or something. Have some soundtrack. Thank you.
Thank you, Sunil. This is sort of a trip down memory lane as far as research on artists goes, because I was asked to give kind of a historical perspective on artists in the labor market. And I have some more detailed information. I just want to make some general comments about it as we move along. One thing I'll mention now is an overarching comment, is the consistency in the information that we have gotten from the census and related sources in terms of the status and role of artists in the labor force. Just zip through this. This is, again, Tom gave the 11 current census artists occupational categories. This is our first trip through memory lane. I believe it was in the 1970s, correct me if I'm wrong, that the NEA began to use census data to report on artists in the workforce. And it's kind of a curious endeavor more than anything else. A colleague and I went back and got public use data for censuses going back to 1940. And do not place too much faith in these percentages of the artist labor force in each of these years, because as you've seen, first of all, the definitions have changed. We created a category that was there for 3 decades, college art, drama, and music teachers, and then it disappeared because the census stopped tracking them as a category. Radio and TV announcers didn't appear until 1970. A category which I really don't know exactly what it means, called showmen, existed in the 1940 census. And within these occupational categories, smaller occupational groups have moved in and out. So as I say, there's probably not that important what percentage these groups made as a whole. The most interesting one, I think, is the growth of designers. For the past several decades, designers have been the single largest category in the artist workforce. Tom covered some of this as well, so I'm just going to mention it briefly. Those of us who have done surveys, direct surveys of individual artists, are confronted with this paradox all the time. The United States, the Census Bureau essentially asks you when you fill out the questionnaire what occupation you're in by asking you, what do you spend the most time doing during a reference week? A lot of artists work part-time as artists or spend vast weeks unemployed as artists and are likely doing something else to earn some income in the meantime. If they answer that question honestly, they show up as in another occupation in the census in any given year. So whether this is good or bad is certainly debatable, but the census weeds out part-time artists to some degree. It weeds out people who are trying to create artist careers to some degree because they'll choose another occupation if they answer that question honestly. These people do get picked up in direct surveys, and I'm sure other people will talk about this, but often when they are, we find out that they make very little income as artists and may make a larger share of their income from doing something else. But still, if you ask them what they are, they say, I'm a visual artist, I'm a singer, or one of those categories. Take a look again at sort of a long string of data on employment and unemployment of artists and a couple of their characteristics over time. One thing, I'm an economist, so I think like one, for better or for worse. One thing that I've always wondered about the artistic profession, and it is a profession, it's always been grouped with the other occupations called professional in the census, is the fact that it's not difficult compared to some occupations to call yourself an artist. You just can't walk into a CPA firm and say, I'd like a job, I want to be an accountant, or I am an accountant. You have to have credentials. You have to have credentials as a lawyer. You even have to have credentials as a public school teacher. To teach in a university like I do, you have to have a PhD. Most artist occupations, with the exception possibly of architects, they're less credentialed. Okay, there's not necessarily a college program that you have to graduate from before you can be seriously considered to be one of these types of people. It varies from occupation to occupation, but from our point of view, it suggests that the occupation hasn't created any entry barriers. Nice thing about entry barriers is the fewer people that can get in easily, the higher your incomes are likely to be if you get inside. Of course, the other thing that makes the artist occupations unusual is that people want to be artists even if they're not being very successful at their art. Most people who decide to embark on some other career and it doesn't work out, they change careers. But arts is more of a calling, and people still want to be that person even if they're facing some serious occupational and income barriers in their efforts. So first, just there's a lot of numbers here. I'm just going to touch upon the sort of the major trends here. We go from some personal characteristics of artists in the censuses from 1940 on to 2000. And at the bottom of the table, we have some labor force characteristics. A couple of things that show up. Artists have gradually, and each decade, by the way, noticed that they're compared to all professional workers less artists. Okay. In terms of educational levels, they've pretty much drawn even in terms of the average years of schooling in the labor force. Obviously, both professions were heavily dominated by men in the beginning. The percentage of women in both has increased over time, as has the percentage of minorities. But one thing that kind of surprised me the first time I looked at these numbers is there's a higher percentage of women in all other professions than there is in the arts, and there's a higher percentage of minorities in all other professions than there is in the arts. In every decade, artists were more likely to be unemployed. They were more likely to be self-employed, as Tom mentioned. They were less likely to work full-time, and they worked fewer hours and fewer weeks. Next two slides just kind of summarize most of what I just said, but obviously I couldn't put words and numbers on this same slide. Most of what's on this slide I've just mentioned a couple of things that don't show up directly in the data but are worth noting. Tom also referred to the fact that artists are likely to hold second and third jobs. That's very true. In fact, I haven't looked at the figures very recently, but either the number one or the number two profession in terms of holding a second job is musicians. Musicians are competing with firefighters for the greatest frequency of holding second jobs. And most arts occupations are high on the list of moonlighting. So, although all the income in the census is attributed to that primary occupation, when it comes to artist occupations, probably less of it was actually earned in that primary occupation. If you're another type of professional, such as an accountant, chances are 100% of your income comes from your work as an accountant. If you're a musician, chances are you do a lot of other things to fill in the downtimes when you're not able to get a job or you're not performing. Another thing which we haven't really looked at that carefully, artists, when they're asked to list the industry in which they work, cite some very unusual types of industries. They're not in the ones that you think they'd be working in. And that may also reflect the fact that they have a, whatever you want to call it, a day job or something like that, that may be in a different industry, but yet they still call themselves artists when they're asked the question about what's your occupation. A couple of other things, again, most of these I've mentioned already. Let me move on. You're going to see a couple of slides that talk about artists' state of residence in 2000. I hadn't really thought about it at the time when these slides were put together, but you're going to see red states and blue states, and they don't mean what you think they do, okay? We use the common technique used by regional economists called a location quotient. Simply means that for any of these occupations in the arts, we look at the percentage of people in the labor force in that state, in that occupation, and compare it to the nationwide average. So if the percentage is, the ratio is greater than 1, you have disproportionately more of that occupation working in your state. If it's less than 1, then obviously it's disproportionately less. This pretty much follows up in what Tom said earlier about concentrations of artists in particular areas. So I'll just run through this quickly. Probably hard to read the legend there. This is all artists. And a dark blue means a location quotient of 2 or greater. Okay, so clearly the primary states, not only in terms of numbers, but also in concentration of artists, are New York and California. Okay, and there are a few others, but kind of an interesting thing here is that there are so few states that have disproportionately more artists than the average, and there are many, many states that have disproportionately less. So again, it's quite a concentrated industry, and I think the reasons are, most cases that we'll see here, are fairly obvious as to why artists live where they live. Okay, this is all artists. This is visual artists. Okay, here we have a bit of a wider distribution, but clearly there's a preference for the coasts. And again, here we might have an actual blue state, red state dichotomy, something closer to it. Visual artists are a bit more widely distributed, concentrated in New England and in the West. Performing artists. These are really concentrated. Basically New York, California, Nevada, Florida, and areas around here, DC, and areas around New York. Again, for the obvious reasons, they're basically capitals of performance in Los Angeles and New York, Disney World in Florida, and compared to these areas, there aren't many, relatively speaking, performing artists. Writers. One of the things I did for the National Endowment was a survey writers a while back, and we looked at this with 1970, I guess it was, census data. If you wanted to pick a state where you would like to live in and your job had no constraints on your choice, you'd probably pick one of the states where writers live. So they seem to be pretty footloose in terms of where they can choose to live, even though many of them in this category do have employers. Musicians. Well, like total performers, but just what you probably would expect. A couple of states suddenly show up as being important. Tennessee, Louisiana, for example, as well as the typical centers of entertainment in the United States. So it's pretty much, I think, what you'd expect. Okay. Final topic is earnings of artists, and some of the things that sort of we wonder about when it comes to earnings. How much would artists earn given the fact that, again, number one, it's easy to declare yourself an artist relative to other occupations. Number two, the way many artists work, particularly performing artists, they don't hold steady year-in, year-out jobs, and that's likely to affect both the level and the distribution of earnings in those occupations. Again, two tables. First one is artist earnings versus professional earnings, going back to 1940 census. In every year, artists earn more. Okay, that's basically the bottom line. But parsing this data a little farther, the main reason, I'm sorry, artists earn less. What am I saying? The main reason why they earn less is they work fewer hours a year. If you look at that hourly wage figure at the bottom of the table for both artists and professionals, it's about the same. So the main difference between artists' incomes and those of other professions is the fewer hours worked in a year. Another intriguing thing about the artist profession, we looked at, basically took all professional occupations and looked at those which had the greatest earnings variability. Different ways to measure this, and they're all listed here. These are the top 15. 8 of the top 15 are artist occupations. 8 of the 11 NEA artists are in this table. The only 3 that are not, architects and designers, have more traditional types of occupations, and the other one is dancers. And I think the other difference there is there aren't any really highly paid dancers as there are highly paid actors, musicians, and other members of the labor force. So they didn't make the variability. And it's shown in their actual mean incomes. They make less income per year than any other of the 11 artist occupations. Okay, let me just finally wrap it up. We see from the table, artist earnings have averaged about 3/4 to 80% of what other occupations make. Architects make the most, dancers make the least. We see racial disparities in earnings, and we see gender disparities in earnings from year to year. We see huge earnings variability between occupations as well, with actors having the most, and on that list of 15, second most was athletes, perhaps no surprise to many of us. Census, again, doesn't tell us about earnings from different types of jobs. Further research that we've done on discrimination in the arts suggests that these gender and racial differences are not due to simply women working fewer hours or things like that, but even when you look at comparable characteristics, these differences in earnings still remain. And lastly, the artist occupations are heavily dominated by those that we sometimes call winner-take-all markets, where a few really outstanding performers or well-recognized people earn much more money than the mean in those occupations. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. That was great. Anyone have any questions here for either, actually it could be about anything, but Greg and Tom, I think, about what you've just heard? I think you see some of the challenges we have, in kind of getting around some of the issues. We're locked into certain realities with the census data. Any questions? Oh, thanks, Stephen.
I wonder what research is done to figure out how the categories should change or are changing. So we know we have periodic classification changes, but what's the systematic research that informs those changes? And is there a suggestion for ways that we could better classify artists? Do we need to systematically re-examine on a periodic basis what those categories include and try and update them? I know that makes it hard for comparisons over time, but what's your thoughts about that?
Well, it's the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Office of Management Budget that actually sort of coordinate that process once every 2 years, every 10 years. It's the standard occupational classification system that they use, and in Census Bureau's codes are derived from that. The process in terms of how much research goes into that, I think, is a bit of a question mark. I think that what tends to happen is federal agencies make a case for when they have working group meetings periodically for particular oversights and they make opportunities. Some of that has to do with industry occupation studies that go on at BLS in terms of their occupational outlook handbook and their occupational outlook division. But I haven't actually, I've been to a few working groups where there was sort of minimal input. I don't know if Deirdre or anyone else has been involved in that at all.
Oh, sorry. Jennifer Day, actually we have a, from the Census Bureau, U.S. Census Bureau, Jennifer Day.
The standard occupation classification is updated basically every 10 years. And we have just finished the last round of updating those occupations. And it's, OMB has a policy committee of several agencies led by BLS and Census and other agencies. And we send out several Federal Register notices saying we're going to be looking at these classifications, and interest groups then write into OMB saying, we want to change, we recommend changes. And so that's how the process goes, and we look into those changes, and then the committee goes through and decides, whether it's really legitimate occupation change. Many times people write in, and what they're talking about is a title rather than an occupation. And so the new SOC for 2010 will be coming out late this year, and then we will be updating again starting, it is going to come out in 2018. We're going to be switching the timeline on when we're redoing them because we're trying to line it up with the NAICS, which is the industry classification system, so that we don't have so many bumps in our data. So that will start probably mid-decade around 2015, 2016, when we'll start the Federal Register notice again for changing the classifications. There's pluses and minuses to it. Certainly, as you mentioned, we don't like to keep changing occupations because it's really a bear when you're trying to do analysis over years. On one hand, but we want to, the idea is to keep the occupations current with what the workforce really is doing.
Deirdre?
I think that because all of that occupation classification involves hundreds of occupations, and what we're talking about here is focusing on just artists. And what we've done a lot over the decades in these artist in the workforce studies is to use the crosswalks developed within the Census Bureau that evaluate how the changes impact the individual occupations and attach proportional estimates of how the artist occupations have changed through the decades. And that's been written up in some of the NEA studies over the decades.
But Stephen, I don't know if this is kind of what you're getting at too. Has there been a concerted? Are you asking also? Has there been a concerted effort among researchers in the field to come up with a plan or strategy for, rather than various comments just trickling into the Census Bureau? I don't know if we have any suggestions or anything's come out of that. That's kind of why we want to talk about this today. Any questions or thoughts, Randy? Oh, yeah, that doesn't have to be about that. Oh, David, sorry.
Well, I was actually going to ask a question for Tom. I was very interested in the secondary job findings and the 300,000, and I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about, how those data, where they're coming from, and there's probably some kind of threshold even within that, who even qualifies as a second, as a worker with a second job in the arts.
Actually, this is the case where we lobbied the Census Bureau and the Bureau of Labor Statistics to include a second job question along with some other federal agencies such as the U.S. Department of Agriculture was interested in second jobs for farmers, which became more and more important over the decades. So after many years in some cases and some of the test modules that Census sent out for long-form questionnaires, they had second jobs on there and tested them. But eventually, the current population survey started including a second job question, and I think the year was 1994. It was later in the 90s when they first published data from it. And the estimates that I quoted were from 2005. And basically, there were people in the labor force who had identified that they had a second job in addition to their primary job, and it was in one of these 11 occupations, and the figure was about 300,000. It ran about 12.8%, if I remember correctly, for artists' occupations. Professionals as a whole, I think, was about 5%. So it was 2.5 times. It was clearly much greater than any of the other occupations in terms of an occupational group. Clearly, artists stood out. And that's, unfortunately, to get the detailed data on artist occupation, we have to lean on the largesse of the Bureau of Labor Statistics to produce some unpublished tabulations. So that's where that came from. It's in our research note. I believe it's 94, but it's on the website.
David Cohen.
Thank you. I'd like to ask a question of Professor Wassall. Am I saying that right? You mentioned that part of artists earning less is that they work fewer hours. And in a sense, this is related to Randy's question, the definition of work. When I talk to actors, a major part of their work is auditioning. It may be 90% of their work some years. And my question is effort to obtain work counted against hours in terms of income and earnings?
Since basically the people who are answering this question across all occupations are filling out the same census form, I think the answer is no. When you get the chance to survey individual artists, you can ask tailored questions. How much time do you spend rehearsing, looking for work and things like that? That, again, may be an important thing if you're in the performing arts. But that will not show up in the census data. To interpret the question literally, it's how many hours a week do I spend actually doing my work?
Carrie?
Hi. I had a couple of questions. In defining whether someone is an artist, I noticed that in the 1990, college teachers in the arts were counted as artists, and then it looked like it wasn't in more recent ones, and I'm wondering where that's going, and also whether artists who earn a significant amount of their income teaching, maybe not in college, but maybe in other educational arenas, are counted as artists or as educators. That was my first question. And my second question was whether statistics gathered for artists who maybe have a secondary job also collects data on artists who might have Social Security or Social Security disability income as a significant part of their support.
I'll answer your second question first. Tom referred to the current population survey, which is done monthly and is the basis of various reports that we will see. Unemployment rate, for example, is calculated from it. Once a year, they collect detailed information on earnings, and there is some pretty detailed information on where incomes come from. So the census does this every 10 years, but CPS does it every year. The problem with the CPS is it's a much smaller sample, and the artists, as you see, are a small sample of the labor force. So the data aren't necessarily as accurate as they are when they come from the CPS or the American Community Survey. Other folks might want to chime in on this, but prior to 2000, among the occupations that the census tracked was a variety of college professors of various disciplines. That just disappeared into one category. Another category which the census never tracked is all those teachers in elementary and secondary schools who teach music, for example, or art. They've never been a separate category, and they just show up as elementary and secondary school teachers.
One of the reasons why these things disappear, what the Census Bureau does is we have a survey where we ask you to tell us what your occupation is. We have to, in our list of occupations that we collect the data and then code them to occupations, and it has to be collectible. So you may say that you're an art teacher, but somebody else may say you're an elementary teacher who specializes in art, and somebody else may just say elementary teacher. Or in college professors, you may be teaching more than one discipline, so where do we put you? So where we feel that there's an occupation that is very difficult to collect and get good estimates, we will roll them up into a larger estimate. And that's why sometimes you'll see things, as you mentioned, disappear from one decade to the next, because it's just become very difficult to collect. We're not getting good estimates. It's all over the place.
Yes, just to build on Jennifer's comment just a little bit, I think what happened, there used to be post-secondary teachers, college and university post-secondary teachers of art, drama, and music was the category. The post-secondary college university teachers not elsewhere classified category grew to 60%. So you college and university professors chose not to specify that you're working in art, drama, and music. And that group was actually shrinking rather dramatically, and I think that was part of the inspiration for the collapse, because over each decennial census, the number who fell into that not elsewhere classified, because they didn't declare the particular category that they worked in, grew.
Any other questions, thoughts, suggestions? No? Well, why don't we're actually a little ahead, but that's good, because we have, oh, sorry. Holly Sidford.
I'm very interested in the question you asked about auditioning and other forms of getting work being part of the equation for what counts as hours worked. Because in the arts, for artists, I think a lot of that work is actually a form of credentialing. In other sectors, for example, for consultants or other sectors where getting work is called business development, and it's actually a legitimate form of expenditure of hours. How is that data collected or registered, and could we do a crosswalk for artists? Anybody who could answer that question?
We ask, did you do any work for pay or profit? And then it's up to you, the respondent, to tell us what you did. So if you consider, like a consultant, that their soliciting work or whatever is part of pay or for profit, then yes, so it's self-report, and so we're taking you on face value of what you're saying. So if you consider auditioning part of that or not, that you may consider that part of just working, but if it's self-report basically.
Just one specific footnote to that. Technically, in the current population survey, if they said, well, I did such and such, does that count? The technical definition is if you did an hour or more for pay or profit in the survey week, you were employed. So that's the sort of bare minimum criteria. And I did have the personal experience some number of years ago to go on a current population survey interview, and it was a retired couple, one of which mentioned in passing that they taught some music lessons, and initially was going to say they were not employed, but as it turned out, they wound up being recorded as employed because they had taught for an hour or more in the survey week.
All right, if there are no more questions, we'll just move ahead. We have with us, we've had the pleasure of working with Joan Jeffri on a jazz musician study that you'll see out in the foyer. We look forward to hearing what she's learned by studying artists through direct. A lot of the discussion we just had, by the way, about survey methods, or rather some of the limitations of the surveys, we will be exploring later on in some of the open discussion.
Thank you, everyone. A little bit of an overview of different kinds of questions and research on artists that we all have before I talk about some of our work, although you may know me most recently by a study we just completed a couple of years ago on aging visual artists. That was a sample of what someone said about it, 93-year-old visual artist. So I think one of the questions we're here to ask is, what's the point of collecting research on artists? And here are some of the points we might want to address during the day. Are we trying to get artists on the national radar? Position them as central to society, clearly one of my own agendas. Make program and policy changes here at the NEA and communities, advocacy. Is part of this to restore individual artist grants to the NEA, something we should, if that's the elephant in the room, we should talk about it. And here are some of the traditional sources that we all use to talk about artists. The census and BLS and ACS will be well discussed today and have already been discussed in part. And of course there's state arts agency data, union data, service organization data. An interesting thing when we talk about unions, and I know David's going to do that in a minute, artists may be vetted in some way to be members, but also the eligibility requirements vary so widely from union to union. For example, from having to have an apprenticeship to be in the Directors Guild all the way to getting a contract to be a member of Actors Equity. And those kinds of requirements may make us look differently at what we think is information on artists. Of course, that has given rise to many discrete kinds of surveys. Funders have done many studies about artists who are applying for money so they can think how to deal with that. The New York Foundation for the Arts is an example. Stephen Tepper is going to talk in a little while about the SNAP project, which is a very important project in trying to track people who study as artists through their lifetimes and see what this all means. That's obviously very long term. And then there have been a number of private studies by places like the Urban Institute and RAND and the research center that I run, mostly on the condition and situation and support structures for artists. So this is kind of a general, I'm probably leaving something out, but the general categories of studies on U.S. artists, not only U.S., but these are kinds of some of the points of view that people use when they study artists. Raymond Moulin and Pierre-Michel Mongel have taken a very important sociological view on artists in France. Greg's talked about a more economic census-based approach. Many of you know the work of Howard Gardner, more psychological approaches, the many kinds of creativity we all have. The Urban Institute's approach might be called anthropological. And information and advocacy, the kind of thing that Dance NYC has collected in New York City. So those are just some of the various ways that I think we look at gathering research on artists. And we all face a number of commonalities. Some of them have already been invoked. How are we going to define artists? We'll get to professional artists in a minute. How are we going to define artists? And how are we going to define art, especially with the changing landscape? I know Maria's going to talk a little bit about hybrid art, which is difficult to categorize. We all face the same kinds of problems, which is the size of the sample, the composition of the sample, the diversity, very important, of the sample, how representative that sample is when we select it, and how deep can the questions be? I mean, we can, obviously you know that census questions are limited. I think there's been a lot of progress in the varieties of studies that come from the census and adding questions, but that's another reason that independent research goes on, because I think a lot of independent researchers feel they can get at deeper questions by asking smaller samples of artists. Agenda-based, that's on here because a wonderful funder in Chicago actually said to me when I was fundraising for one of my studies, you know, all this research on artists is just a proven agenda that already exists, and it stopped me. And he said, what are you going to do if you find something that's not popular? And that's something we need to think about. In other words, you know, reporting what we find, not just what we'd like to find. Urban versus rural, another theme that I think will come through today. So much work has been done on urban artists. Some of the methodologies I'm using may also give us a chance to look at more rural artist populations. I know there are people thinking about this also using census data. Artists live everywhere. We don't want to just report on artists who live in cities, even though many of them do live in cities. You probably have heard about this methodology that we used for the study on jazz musicians, which Sunil mentioned. We did a study for the NEA in 2000 on jazz musicians in these 4 cities, and we used 2 different samples, what I call a grassroots sample using this method, Respondent-Driven sampling, and a sample from the American Federation of Musicians. What this allowed us to do, which I think is the only time it's been done except for the census, is to actually tell you how many jazz musicians there are in these 4 cities by using the universe, defined universe of the AFM, and the rather undefined universe of the RDS sample. For those of you who know about RDS, it's just very simply a kind of peer referral scheme where you take 6 or 8 people who are very well connected, have big social networks, you interview them in person, you give them 4 coupons. There's a number on the coupon. At the end of the interview, you say, would you please give these 4 coupons to your peers, in this case, who are also jazz musicians in one of these 4 cities. And what you get looks like the branches of a tree. You get this incredible social network where 4 people and then 4 more and 4 more and 4 more. So from one vocalist in jazz, we got 110 jazz musicians. In the study we recently completed on aging visual artists, from one aging visual artist, we got 99 painters. And what this tells you, aside from it being a nice thing to do, is how people are socially networked to each other. Is it because they went to school together, because of the same religion, because they were trained together, because they've lived in the same neighborhood? So it's a much deeper analysis of what you're looking at. It's a couple of the things we learned in the jazz study, which were kind of surprising to us, was that people with any level of education who are jazz musicians have the same size of social networks, except for jazz musicians with a doctorate who had 8 times larger networks. And that would make sense when you think about it, because they're entering a whole different arena that they haven't been in before, so their networks expand. But that's a lot to expand. Difficult linear career path. This is true, of course, of many artists. 32% played with more than 16 groups a month. A lot of jazz musicians we interviewed, had this lone wolf syndrome. They felt the system wasn't really helping them. They had to kind of go it alone. The unions weren't helping them. The American Federation of Musicians doesn't know how many jazz musicians it has. And I'll give you an example. Health insurance, which I know has been a great concern to many of us in the arts. 63% of these kind of grassroots jazz musicians had some medical coverage versus 89% of the unionized jazz musicians, big difference. And the how many that I mentioned at the beginning, this is how many. 32,000 jazz musicians in New York, 18,000 in San Francisco, and you're wondering about the 1750 in New Orleans, aren't you? So I called up Jerry Vergas, who's the AFM representative, when I was doing the study, before we had released the results. And I said, just because you know the field, union, non-union, what would you say if I asked you how many jazz musicians were in New Orleans? And he said, 1,800. So I guess we might have been really close. Here are a few things we learned about aging professional visual artists in New York City's 5 boroughs, a study we just completed 2 years ago. The average age was 62 or over. They spent a lifetime making art, and they had to be resident in the 5 boroughs. The median age and the mean age was 73. The reason this is important is that almost all independent studies of artists, including my own, find the median and mean age to be somewhere between 38 and 42. So nobody has really looked at artists this age. Average annual income, $30,000 a year. Only $1,750 from their art. However, 85% of them sold the work within the last year, which means they're engaged in the marketplace. One of the discussions I often have with Ted Berger is that what a lot of people don't realize is that many artists are asset rich and cash poor. So we all have a safety net, a house, or something that we hope we don't need to use. But it's the daily living that's so difficult. To live on $30,000 a year in New York is almost impossible. 44% of these artists live in subsidized housing. The minute they die or leave, young artists can't afford to move into New York. I mentioned health insurance for jazz musicians in terms of these aging artists. Of course, remember that many of them have Medicare, but 93%, even higher, have health insurance, compared to occupational prestige studies, in which 99% of the people have health insurance. One of the things we did with the Aging Artist Study is to compare the Aging Artist findings with aging studies of people who are not artists, just the general population, to see how artists fared. Usually artists did better, not in this case. This was very counterintuitive for me. I come from the performing arts. I assumed all the visual artists are alone, working in their studio, don't talk to anybody. I was completely wrong. 77% of them communicate every day or every week with other artists. This trumps their communication with spouses, children, relatives. You can imagine what this says about their personal relationships, but never mind. How do you turn this into action? We're very interested in the Research Center in applied research. We've gotten some extraordinary results from this Aging Artist Study. Probably the most astounding is to get free real estate for anybody, especially an artist in New York, and we got the New York City Department of Aging to give 13 free artist studios in the senior centers. They're working with the 5 borough arts councils to figure out how to do this. And one of the things we found from the Aging Artist Study was that 61% of the artists have no preparation for work after their death, and 1 in 5 have no documentation for their work at all. So in cooperation with the Joan Mitchell Foundation, which developed a wonderful software for documenting work called Lasting Legacy, we're starting a new interdisciplinary, intergenerational course at Columbia next fall, which will have 12 graduate students from occupational therapy, public health, social work, arts administration, studio art, and art education. Teams of 2 graduate students, interdisciplinary teams, to work with 1 aging visual artist from our study over a year's period to document their work, the first semester being a course on working with older people, gerontology, evaluation, assessment, an oral history component, the second semester being documentation. This is a pilot. We'll evaluate it when it's done for a year. We'll do it with 3 universities after that, and then the National Center for Creative Aging will help us take it national. Right now it's somewhat about technology. In 20 years it won't be at all about technology because everyone will know the technology. What it's really about is intergenerational learning. Technology is the vehicle, and documenting the work of artists who are getting older. Our next phase is information on artists 4, on aging performing artists, these 5 kinds of artists: actors, dancers, choreographers, musicians, and singers. We have done studies on all these kinds of artists in the past. That's one of the reasons for the selection. So we have some comparative data backwards. We're doing it in Los Angeles and New York. So what are some of our challenges since we've done 25 years of independent studies on living artists? A real challenge, I think, for all independent artist researchers is comparison with larger data sets. So to show how artists are comparable to the general population, whatever you're studying. using questions from national surveys, which we've done in the aging study, comparing two probability samples or more. Some comparisons have been done by other researchers using our data, Sarah Montgomery, David Throsby in Australia. And some of our studies have been replicated. One of our earlier studies was done on younger artists under 35 in Portugal, so it's interesting to have comparisons from other countries as well. Skating between competing needs. Now, we're doing a study of aging artists, and some of the questions we are asking have to do with the positive and negative emotions that go into your art, and everything from joy and a sense of humor to suicidal thoughts. There's a very thin line here between asking these kinds of questions and doing a medical intervention. Of course, every time I present these results at a hospital, I get 5 doctors and 10 nurse practitioners who want me to do a medical intervention, which I'm certainly not equipped to do. But at a later iteration of our work, it might be that someone else in the medical field does that. I said, I just can't imagine going to an aging dancer after I finish the survey and saying, could we now do an MRI on your brain and take your pulse? So that's not what we're going to do. I mentioned the rural versus urban problem and international comparisons, which we need to think about into how to make this more global in terms of comparisons. Some of the key issues, one of them, very big issue, professionalism. Professional to what end? There's a traditional definition of professional. Here are some of the other reasons that people need the definition of professional: unions, funders, qualifying for subsidized housing. Is this against, I love Stephen Tepper's book about the pro-am movement. Is this against greater participation? Because is everyone an artist? Finally, something we have to look at. We have 20 years of data investigating professionalism, and here's how it lays out. It's very interesting when I looked at this. These are the 3 definitions we've used on our own for professionalism. The marketplace definition, the education and affiliation definition, and the self and peer definition. And we also have information regarding people who have union memberships or lapsed union memberships in which we can look at this. This is what people chose over the last 20 years or 25 years. Equity actors in 1988, equity and non-equity actors in 1990 and 92, craftspeople and painters in the same period. RDS jazz musicians, those grassroots jazz musicians, New Jersey dancers, and aging visual artists. If you look at this closely, you're going to realize that all the performing artists picked the marketplace definition, and the visual artists picked, I have an inner drive to make art. This is something that's a very rough analysis. That's something we need to look at. Challenges for the NEA. Later, I know we're going to talk about cultural workers. That's the name of this forum. I'm making a plea for looking at artists. There's not enough looking at artists. I would rather not see it complicated by all kinds of other cultural workers. That's a personal bias. Multi-categories we talked about. Is funding for NEA research on artists or the NEA appropriation based on census numbers, and are census numbers being used to justify funding for artist research, which has a whole different set of agendas? And finally, a central resource for artist research. You know that CPAND at Princeton is a wonderful resource for researchers all over the world. I'm very much hoping that that can be expanded. And again, we need to answer the question, what's the point of collecting research on artists? Thank you very much.
Wow. Thanks so much, Joan, for framing those questions very eloquently. I think we're really looking forward to that discussion. We're happy to have a representative of artist union groups here with us today to offer his opinion of what are some research needs going forward. You don't have a PowerPoint, I believe, right? Or, no, right, a handout. So I think Lexi was going to, great, thank you. And I think if there are copies for the audience too, that'd be great. We look forward to hearing what, I was going to say that this is a great bridge because both your presentation and Joan's, I think, get into putting the research to work, which is our next segment. So take it away.
Thank you very much, Sunil. As I said to someone before this started, working with 24 national unions that represent professional and technical people, I start every day with comprehensive ignorance. I am feeling that a little more than most days in the midst of this group, but I look forward to the chance to learn from all of the folks in the room. We are passing around my attempt to circumvent the 10-minute limit, which is to put down on paper the points we would like you to carry away, including the answer to Professor Jeffri's question, what is this about? From our perspective, this is about enabling policymakers at the federal, state, and municipal levels to serve arts professionals more effectively. And I've got 10 minutes, so I'm going to do 4 points. The 4 points go like this. Point 1, we value and welcome your work. Point 2, we have questions. Point 3, we bring value to the table. Point 4, together we can improve data quality. That will benefit research, policymakers, and artists' lives. Point 1, we value and welcome your work. A chief of staff for a top federal legislator calls on a Sunday night. He asks for good data about the economic impact of the arts to defend an allocation of stimulus funds. Good data are good to have. Unions are not research institutions. We value and welcome your work, and we extend thanks to Sunil Iyengar and the NEA for creating the opportunities that today represents. Permit me also to say what a pleasure it is to see here people whom I know, like Deirdre Gaquin, have met with, like Randy Cohen of Americans for the Arts, have heard present, like Joan Jeffri of Columbia, and have consulted, like Barbara Davis of the Actors Fund. I want also to acknowledge the presence and valuable contributions of my colleague, Alexis Spencer Notarbartolo, who's researcher and representative for the Department for Professional Employees, and I bring greetings from Paul Almeida, president of the department. Point 2, we have questions. You've got 8 pages of them in the handout. Think Venn diagrams, not boxes. An artist may be an actor one day, a director the next, a playwright the third, then a dancer, then a musician, singer, actor, and may have spent the previous week as a caterer. Ask her what she is. A one-word answer won't suffice, but too often it is all we allow for. We're distributing the document you have. It lists questions that go to the trajectory of artists' careers and to their economic impact. It suggests research topics and projects. It sets out in very rough form sources of data that unions and affiliated entities might provide. It provides contact information for my colleague Alexis and me. Most important, it suggests a radical collaboration. Grant makers in the room, please listen. Permit me to read from page 3. To enlarge the conversation, one can imagine, for example, a collaboration to design a multi-pronged research strategy. Elements might include, first, an assessment of existing research and methodologies with today as a starting point. Second, collaboration among government agencies, foundations, arts organizations, unions, and frontline professionals, I want to underscore that, to design research questions and invite individuals to respond. Third, a careful and targeted focus on discrete occupations rather than rubrics lumping together multiple occupations. I think we have already heard a number of people talk about the 11 census categories. And from our perspective, those are problematic. As Joan's comment about the difference between performing artists and visual artists, the difference between market definition of identity and inner drive suggests there are vast cultural differences that these 11 categories gloss over. Fourth, longitudinal studies of performing artists and the professionals who support them, refined by discrete occupations that track career arcs and the impact of changing media technologies. I want to point at that last element. The world is changing, and the ways in which the world is changing are affecting arts careers as well. Technology, digitization, computer networks, globalization, automation, for visual artists and for performing artists, the world is changing. Fifth, time diaries to generate data about the interaction of multiple occupations and sources of income. Time diaries, occupational longitudinal studies. Sixth, using the longitudinal and time diary data to improve questions for an interpretation of more general survey data. So, how's that for a modest proposal? Organizational collaborations, longitudinal studies, and time diaries. None happen quickly. All take resources. Perhaps this room brings together the resources and commitment that could make them happen. If budget constraints preclude government action now, perhaps a consortium of foundations could fund pilot programs. Those programs could in turn offer models and lessons for public implementation. So much for point 2. Point 3, we bring value to the table. The Department for Professional Employees, AFL-CIO, or DPE, brings together 24 national unions representing more than 4 million professional and technical people. Among the 24 national unions are 9 representing people in the arts, entertainment, and media. Actors Equity Association, American Federation of Musicians, American Federation of Television and Radio Artists, American Guild of Musical Artists, International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees, International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, Office and Professional Employees International Union, Screen Actors Guild, and Writers Guild of America East. These unions and their members bring value, deep and long firsthand experience to the table. DPE provides a bridge to the leaders and staffs of these unions. In a collaboration, we have organized sessions to design and refine research, to map and propel outreach to research respondents, and to check that respondents hear a researcher's questions as the researcher intended them. I was pleased to see that the 2006 report, for which Ann Markison is the lead author, Crossover, How Artists Build Careers Across Commercial, Nonprofit, and Community Work, mentions aid in reaching artists from the Screen Actors Guild and the American Federation of Musicians. And there have been other references already this morning to unions as a source of data. Both Screen Actors Guild and the musicians are among the 9 arts, entertainment, and media unions affiliated with DPE. And under DPE auspices, those 9 unions have also benefited from and responded to presentations by Sunil Iyengar and Joan Jeffri. Point 4, together we can improve data quality. That will benefit research, policymakers, and artists' lives. On behalf of the department and the 9 arts, entertainment, and media unions that DPE includes, I bring a profound thanks to the National Endowment for the Arts for organizing our discussion today, and add a personal thanks again to Sunil. There is a huge expertise in this room. I believe that together we can improve data quality. With a little luck and a lot of work, that will benefit research about artists, the workforce, and the economy. It will provide policymakers with better information, and it will lead to better policies to improve artists' lives and our national arts. I thoroughly enjoyed hearing the presenters who preceded me. I look forward to listening to the others and the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, David. There's a lot to bite off from this document, and I'm really grateful for it. I almost feel like we should take some time to be quiet and read it, just to understand it. But honestly, I think that was, I'm glad you framed that for us. Is there any, this is bound to stir some comment, I would hope. Is there any, are there any questions? I mean, it raises a lot of interesting ideas, but of course all of them have their own, especially when you talk about the types of, the sort of the suggestions in terms of time use diaries and longitudinal studies that I know carry resource questions too. And I'd like to maybe invite people to talk about that, or perhaps even about some of what Joan Jeffri presented in her methods. As you see, they differ significantly from sort of the national government source derived data research that we've been providing. Anne?
Well, I have a comment on Joan's presentation, then I'd like to pose a question to David. And the comment is, which, thanks, Joan, very much. This is really a great run through lots of things, and other people too. It's really building, and that's wonderful. I wanted to pick up on the international comparison point and just note that census data for many other countries is now available through the Minnesota Population Center, which is, a grantee of the Census Bureau and national organizations. And it enables us to get the same sort of public use microdata sample information on occupations for other countries. I spent 2 months in Brazil the spring before last helping a team at the university, the Federal University of Minas Gerais, set up equivalent work in Brazil to what many of us have done in the United States using artistic occupations. It's particularly focused on artists. And so I think, and the Minnesota Population Center is putting, as it has delivered to all of us, our PUMS data free of charge. It is now doing the same thing for many other countries. So this will very soon allow us to do this comparative research, because many other countries use occupational codes that are very close to ours. So I'm looking forward to that. Well, I'm just really thrilled that David is here to present this. And I wanted to say that I have found it difficult, and by the way, I'm a member of the National Writers Union. I don't know if that's in your group. But we belong to the UAW. This is a funny thing. But anyway, but I wanted to know if you had advice about how to approach unions when we were researchers. Actually, we had a very hard time getting the Los Angeles unions to work with us on our project. And I only was able to do it because it turned out somebody very high placed in the arts community in Los Angeles was married to somebody who was, a principal in the American Federation of Musicians. And I understand that unions don't have a lot of staff time. They don't have a lot of people. They're stretched thin. They only have the resources of their members. But how would you advise to those of us who are doing studies on artists in particular regions, how do we approach the union locals in those areas, and or should we come to you? Should we go to the research departments of those organizations nationally? How can we present what we're doing in a way that will really elicit the help? And we know that you have lots of great data that we could really use.
So thank you for that question. In the document that was distributed on page 7, there is the notable line under point 4, as membership organizations that assist people's careers and well-being, unions seek to protect their members' interests and privacy. And unions are sometimes very protective of internal data, of circulation lists. Sometimes they have specific occupational reasons for doing that, as in stalkers of Screen Actors Guild celebrities. There are issues of personal privacy and a need for protection of members who may be identified and targeted. Having said that, I would say the best way is to think about personal connections, as your comment suggested, and I'm happy to serve as a starting point. Lexi Where is Lexi? In the front row here is happy to serve as a starting point. Unions will want to know, typically, given how short-staffed and how scarce the resources are, and that all the resources come from the contributions of their members, how will this benefit their members? So if you want union data, then you need to come prepared to say how the project will advance the interests of the members to whom the union owes its primary responsibilities. But we are very, very interested in serving as a bridge, in connecting, in developing this. The way I think of this is, I don't know how many people here remember a bonfire of the vanities. Tom Wolfe wrote about the golden crumbs, the rulers of the universe who got the golden crumbs from all our capital and thus became personally wealthy. Well, we have all these people doing arts works, and all the fractions get lost. My view is that those fractions amount to a lot more than anyone takes into account at the national policy level. They're the equivalent of the golden cultural crumbs, as it were. But we'd like to do something to help.
Steve? Stephen?
I guess this is both for Joan and David, especially for data that's collected not through membership lists or union lists in particular, either through respondent-driven sampling or the survey that Link did. What do we know about the differences between artists in the same profession, some who choose to go the union membership route and others who don't? That is, have we done good studies about the added value of union membership for artists who are essentially doing similar work but have chosen different career pathways to do that work? And could we ask those questions with existing data, or do we need to think about new ways to be able to compare artistic careers with unions as an important variable for understanding the added provisions that artists, or just, I mean, there may be benefits, there may also be some downsides to union membership.
We have asked some of those questions, Stephen, so we do have data on certain kinds of artists, and we've also asked not only how many unions you belong to. In this current performing artist study, we're actually asking, because the unions don't collaborate on health and pension benefits, from which unions are you getting your pension and how much are you getting a month, to help the unions actually understand some of this as well. One of the other things we're collecting, which I don't know if it would be as easy for the union, is people who had membership and don't have it anymore, and what are some of the reasons that they don't have it, which also comes out in personal interviews with respondent-driven sampling, and you get a very good sense of how people feel about the union or not, and that may vary from union to union. But David may have some more.
I think that probably not enough research has been done on the topic, and we would welcome research on it.
Question? Oh, okay. I actually had a question for Joan. We were talking about one of the things in your slides you mentioned, it was really interesting, the idea that in some cases with some of the interviews you've been doing with the aging artists, there's been this recognition that there might be a medical, I think you phrased it, medical intervention opportunity in these cases, and people have alerted you to that. Do you see any possibilities for partnerships with the medical community? And to that end, I mean, is the National Institutes of Health, like National Institute on Aging, a likely partner in this kind of data collecting?
The answer is yes, and I'll give you a couple of examples. First of all, on our advisory board is headed by Dr. Robert Butler, who's the first head of the National Institute for Aging, who won the Pulitzer in '75 for a great book on aging called Why Survive? Give you an idea what he thought. We have presented this to several hospitals in New York, and we've gotten a lot of interesting feedback from them. Here's just an example. A nurse practitioner came up to me at St. Vincent's, and she said, the greatest disease in this hospital is not cancer, it's not heart disease, it's isolation. And the fact that you found that 77% of these visual artists communicate with each other, maybe we could talk about those visual artists helping other isolated artists. So other people are thinking about how to piggyback this. We did look at NIH and NIA. We think it's a little too early to do that, but it is something we're thinking about. And we are in touch with a lot of medical professionals to keep them apprised of this as it goes forward.
Great. We have a question in the front row. If you could identify yourself and then...
Sure. My name is Esther Robinson. I work with an organization called Art Home in Brooklyn, New York. And this is a question for Joan. You had mentioned earlier that one of the through lines for the artists, the aging artists, was that they were able to survive due to assets that they had on the side that weren't categorized. And I was wondering if you were in the process of categorizing, what were the assets that meant that someone at 80 could still be practicing their artwork?
Yes, we do have data that asks them if they own a house, if they own a second house, if they own an apartment, if they own a car, if they own more than one car, what they have in savings. I mean, since of course, the research is anonymous and aggregated, we're not talking about any particular people. But yes, we have very definitive answers to that, and we can certainly help you with that if you want that information.
I'm wondering if any research is going on students of art disciplines. I saw, and I don't know how scientific this was, a study from the early 2000s that said at that moment there were about 250,000 students studying various arts disciplines in colleges, and it didn't even include film and video or new media, and that year about 40,000 students were scheduled to graduate. And when we're looking at some of the numbers that we saw, this could represent a huge escalation in areas of unemployment or underemployment by artists. I read in the cover story of Time magazine a few months ago on unemployment, and the author talked about cash for clunkers' careers. And I began to wonder about the communication between the professional end of the field and what's happening in the academy.
Well, we're going to hear later today from, and this might not be, I'm sure this isn't the only such study, but it's certainly one that's very notable. It's one we happen to fund too. Stephen Tepper will be talking about the SNAP project. I actually thought maybe what I could do is show you a slide that I was going to save till later, but it might be kind of interesting here. Yeah, there's this one slide which actually Ellen was involved in putting together just to show you what, from Department of Education data, what the trajectory was when we looked at the number of BA and MA and PhDs in the arts, visual and performing arts that we got from the Department of Education. What you're seeing there, if you look at the first line, it's basically BAs in visual or performing arts as a percentage of all degrees, all bachelor's degrees. So you see that it has grown significantly in recent years, and it's kind of plateauing in the last couple of years. So it's what, 5.6% of all degrees awarded. Then with the master's and doctor's degrees, it's a little more ambiguous. I guess it levels off in the case of doctors. You can barely see the colors there. Oh, master's, sorry. See, I couldn't even. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. It was doctors that were seeing the decline there. But again, slow declines in the last year or two. It's not sort of without any context, but I thought it would be helpful during actually Stephen's presentation, which will be in the next session. Yes, David.
If I could make a comment following up on the question and on your slide confirms a trend that I have heard leaders of performers unions comment on, the increase in people coming out of arts programs, drama programs, and so on. And one question that they're very concerned with is how this alters the culture of the performing community. in terms of how people think of themselves as performers and how they interact as performers. And that, I think your topic is an important one.
Just one comment. It'll be interesting to see if there's a blip, uptick in the trend line when you start factoring in these reality shows that are all about dance and creativity, and sort of giving the notion to young folks that this exciting career out there. So it'll be interesting to see what happens.
Oh, yeah, and just to put some actual numbers, because we've looked at this as well, if you throw in the associate's degrees in the last decade, it's gone from about 80 to 120,000 a year degrees in the arts. A big part of the bulge has been design. At least that's what a lot of university folks tell us, and that certainly corresponds maybe with one of the earlier presentations about growth in design. And actually, I had a question for Joan, but unless someone else wanted to talk on this. Joan, the presentation was great. The interest, the aging Americans and the artists, so interesting. Did you look to see, were a lot of those folks lifelong career artists, or do they come to the artist profession later in life?
Yes, now it is. It's a perfect question. The data we analyzed are from 146 professional artists, meaning they spent a lifetime in their art. The rest of the artists, we surveyed 213. It was very interesting because, as you know, I'm interested in professional versus amateur, and the rest of them said, this is wonderful, we love it, we'll take your survey, but we just picked up a paintbrush last year when we turned 65, and we wouldn't claim that we were professional, which gave us also a little comparison study here to look at. So that was very valuable, but it was very clear when this coupon passing system that you really needed as an artist to give us another professional artist. And the artists were very good in about 8 criteria of definition, which included marketplace and number of gigs and if they got paid, of defining themselves in very particular terms as professionals.
I wanted to also talk about the idea of how some of this information can be applied, and I think one of the pieces of data that was really important to me is the self-employment numbers, the higher level of self-employment in our field and in general professions. And I think it's a question that we've asked at Creative Capital really from the beginning, but I think to re-ask it, what can be inferred about the skill set that people need to really thrive as a working professional, and where are people getting these skills? Our experience is they are not getting them in their arts programs in colleges and universities for the most part. It's changing a little bit, but not nearly enough. I think it's a challenge, I think, to those of us in the field to really figure out what it is that artists need in this environment to really thrive.
Yes, maybe we'll take one more question. Carrie?
I'm not sure if they're exactly questions, but it's just some thoughts to contribute here. They kind of go from both ends of the lifespan. Being a professor, before I was at UIC, I taught in the School of Theater at Florida State University. And one of the things in your union listed questions, which I think are fabulous, one thing in terms of income earning and students just leaving college is the enormous student loan debt that seems to be getting greater and greater and greater, and what kind of barriers to arts careers that student loan burden presents. You know, whether, and I just see this with my own students, if they can take jobs in lower paying and non-steady income. And also their parents are asking us these questions too, to the faculty. So that's a concern. And how long does it take for an artist to pay off student loans? How much default? I see that happening amongst students too. And then in terms of the aging population, I guess this would go across the lifespan too. I'm wondering how disability and and a lot of older people who have disabilities don't claim they're disabled. So that's always complicated too to get those statistics because they'll say they have health problems, but they won't say they have disabilities. How that affects income earning. I mean, most of my work has been on artists who have disabilities and have had disabilities, but I'm curious about people as they become disabled and what kind of barriers those create to income earning.
I don't think we have exactly that information, but a related piece of information which we found spectacular was the resilience of these aging artists, that of all the professional artists, not one of them, even with mental, physical, and emotional challenges, decided not to be an artist. There was a woman who did sculpture with safety pins. She got arthritis in her hands, and she decided to be a watercolorist. Nobody said, I'm not going to be an artist. So that has, we feel that that has implications as being a model for society about how to grow old.
Did anyone in the audience have a question? I think we actually do have time for one more, if there isn't. Or even at the table. Just take my orders from. I think then why don't we just reward ourselves with a break, and we'll be here back at 11 o'clock sharp. Thanks.